Hi, this is Paul. The original first video that I did on commenting on this conversation seemed to stay up, so we'll keep it going. Now I've got my friends here. If I move my head back here, it'll focus on him. We have Joe and Jordan, and they're buddies, and so they're sitting here all nicely. And you see how good that camera focuses? That's a Sony camera. They've paid me not a dime to endorse that, but you know that sucker is following my face. And anyway, let's jump into the next section. Now, what I'm doing with the commentary on this is just hitting some of the sections that I thought I had some things to say about and I thought were particularly good. So this is the first one. I talked about music and Tolkien, and this one about the Bible. Now, this has been getting a lot of traction on on some other Christian pastors and YouTubers. So Jordan has actually tweeted out two of these videos, one by it's kind of a Christian meme channel, and the other one by Doug Wilson and his Canon Press. Now, this Doug Wilson is a whole nother conversation. He had some very interesting conversations back in the day with Christopher Hitchens, and he's got 64,000 subs, and he's got an interesting reputation in the evangelical Christian and Reformed world. And so he did this video on Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson 12 days ago. It was a little late on that. I have to wait until it comes out. And then he just recently did this one on the little clip that came out from Joe Rogan's channel. And I'm actually thinking about, I haven't watched these videos yet. I don't often watch other pastors talk about Jordan Peterson because, quite frankly, I find them dull. And I don't find that they have a lot of interesting things to say. Usually they say things like, these are the ways that Jordan Peterson is kind of close to my tribe, and because he's really famous, well, here's what we think. And that's kind of what they do. And of course, I do what I do. And if you've been around here long enough, you know I do what I do. But I'm sure the people running this website are really happy that, well, he usually gets around between 12 and 20,000 views on each posting. But the Sam Harris one got 42,000, and the Jordan Peterson, the Bible, got 122,000. So I'm seriously tempted to do a commentary on some of these videos, but that's not for today. We're going to continue our longer look at Jordan and Joe Rogan.
I'm sure you're familiar with Douglas Murray's work.
Yes, and Murray, who's very funny, who I like very much, and who's one of the most courageous people I've ever met.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And he had an amazing point about civilizations collapsing, and that when they start collapsing, they become obsessed with gender. And he was saying that you could trace it back to the ancient Romans, the Greeks.
Yeah.
Now, before I go too far into this, I should talk about a little clip I made and a good video that's out there. If you haven't watched this conversation between Benjamin Boyce and Mary Harrington, you might really want to. It was just an outstanding conversation. Mary Harrington has shown up on Rebel Wisdom lately, and her stuff is getting passed around Twitter, and she's written quite a bit of interesting things. She had quite a bit to say about gender.
And I think a lot of the reason we're having these interminable, tedious arguments about gender is just because actually it's a lot less important than it used to be for a lot of the kind of Zoom class people who are having the arguments. In a sense, the internet has cucked all of us.
There's the Mary Harrington zinger.
Part of what makes Benjamin really good at this is he could have come back and had his own little commentary, and he holds back, and he's really good with that.
And by that I mean, the guys who go on about, real masculinity and aesthetics and slunking eggs and whatever, are still, they're still posting thirst traps, just like an Instagram ego, or a lot of them are anyway. And in a sense, they're not, the men and the women just aren't so different, because they're all arguing like high school girls in Twitter slanging matches. And to the extent that everybody's just involved in this constant game of backbiting and Chinese whispers on social media. There is no meaningful difference between the sexes anymore. I mean, just to expand on the idea that the internet has cupped all of us, my thesis is, it's observable and sort of fairly well documented that female aggression is much less direct than, women are just as aggressive and competitive as men, but they go about it differently. Joyce Benenson is good on this. Men tend to be fairly overt in their competition and in forming hierarchies, and when men come into conflict with one another, there's a higher possibility of physical violence than there would be among women. But once you transfer all of human interaction onto the internet, you foreclose the possibility of physical violence, and in a sense, it means that all conflict now happens in the female key.
Everybody's bitchy and bitching.
Yeah, the internet has cupped all of us. Even the guys who are being the loudest about masculinity are still forced into the female key when it comes to fighting, as long as they're doing it online.
Now I want to finish this quote because I clipped it just a little short.
Online. Even the guys who are being the loudest about masculinity are still forced into the female key when it comes to fighting, as long as they're doing it online. I think if men really want to reclaim masculinity, the best way they can start doing it would be to log off and hang out with one another more. And don't tell women about it.
Why not?
I'm going to move on from that question.
Oh, okay.
The only rule about Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. So back to Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson.
To the integration of personality across the sex divide.
I'm sure you're familiar with Douglas Murray's work.
Yes, and Murray, who's very funny, who I like very much, and who's one of the most courageous people I've ever met.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And he had an amazing point about civilizations collapsing, and that when they start collapsing, they become obsessed with gender. And he was saying that you could trace it back to the ancient Romans, the Greeks.
Yeah, Camille Paglia has made much of that.
Yeah,
I think probably it's not so much an obsession with gender; it's a disintegration of categories as a precursor. So it's a marker for if categories dissolve, especially fundamental ones. The culture is dissolving because the culture is a structure of category. That's what it is.
Oops.
right.
So, and in fact, culture is
right there. What is culture? Culture is a remarkably difficult thing to define, and what he does right there is really, really good and important. Let's hear it again.
the fundamental with
that you could trace it back to the ancient Romans, the Greeks.
Yeah, Camille Paglia has made much of that.
Yeah.
I think probably it's not so much an obsession with gender, it's a disintegration of categories as a precursor. So it's a marker for if categories dissolve, especially fundamental ones, the culture is dissolving because the culture is a structure of category.
Okay. The culture is a structure of category, and this very basic categorical difference as that dissolves, well, it's not that culture is necessarily built on those particular categories, but culture is in fact a network of categories, and where do these categories come from? Now, what he's about to say now is what was sort of parceled out in that little YouTube set out by Joe Rogan Experience, because they put out a few clips about the conversation. And it's that little clip that, of course, it's sort of like clickbait for all the clergy types, because, he talked about the Bible, and what he said about the Bible is so confirming to our view about the world. And hey, fair enough, it is. But this portion right here is really the meat of the quote. And you don't understand the rest of the quote, and then oh gosh, we're going to bring this up. So of course, this quote also caught the attention of sort of the other side of the evangelical food fight. So Peter Enns Someone named Logan tweets out, absolutely losing my mind here at Jordan Peterson. Valiant attempt to explain the history of the Codex to Joe Rogan after going to the Museum of the Bible once. Peter ends, it's like watching a high school class report from someone who forgot it was due and is now figuring out how to fill in a few minutes in front of everyone. No, that is not at all what is going on in this quote. And so then to have all of these pastors come on YouTube and say, oh, see, he says the Bible is the foundation of society. But he doesn't mean that in many ways the simplistic way that most of those pastors assume that that quote should be understood. He begins by noting what a culture is. A culture is a matrix of categories. Now, if you look at my video a little while ago about relevance realization and religion, basically via the community, this is how our relevance realization software is coded. Okay, I just finished this morning, at a conversation with BJ Campbell from Hand Waving Freak Outery, which was an outstanding conversation. I've released a couple little clips of it. Why aren't you releasing it now? Because when I do these monologues and commentaries, I usually release these the day after because there's sort of a flow to it. And then when it gets towards the weekend, when I'm busy with like things like church and other things going on, that's usually when I'll release the conversation. So my conversation, I know a lot of you are interested in the BJ Campbell conversation, as well as the Eamon and Catherine Wilson conversation. A couple little clips I released of that too. Those will be coming out either this weekend or early next week. But the point of this is that the relevance realization that we're doing is really deep, and it's coded over generations of culture. So these categories that Peterson is talking about are really the framework of a culture. Well, where do those categories come from? Those categories come from the authorities within the culture and what the culture has learned all along the way and the conclusions the culture has come to. That is the culture. Now, when Jordan talked about the serpent, the passage in Numbers, it's not in Exodus. It's in Numbers about the serpents biting the people and Jesus as the seraph being lifted up on the pole. That was my sermon a couple of weeks ago. All of that is a big part of the desert wandering, and the narrative is always the most interesting thing for us, and so that's what Jordan will focus on. But all of this Mosaic code, what is happening with all this cleanliness and clean laws and all of that is the coding of categories spelled out dramatically, liturgically, sacrificially, cultically in Israel over generations. All of that clean and unclean, touch, don't touch, eat, don't eat, that's all the coding of the culture. Now, this also gets into Owen Barfield and participation. It gets into the way Jesus plays with participation and what Jesus does with dietary laws in the Gospel of Mark, for example. There's a huge amount on this, but basically what religion does is code the categories of the culture. That's what religion does. Maybe I should just play this little clip from my conversation with BJ. So here I was talking to him about how Wokism reminded me of Calvinism, about this religious coding that are missing. They don't really have a
redemption.
They don't have redemption
entirely,
which is a really scary element to not have.
Yeah. They well, the problem with them trying to introduce redemption, and ask me to go back to Vervecki a little bit later, but the problem with their lack of redemption is that the woke religion is rigged to update very quickly. Right. They're one of the things, and this is something that I think Lindsay doesn't get. I don't think he understands this at all, that the truly addictive and thing about the woke, followers, the thing they really like about it is that they are part of the process of generating morality in real time, right? They love that. They love that it's decentralized.
Generating morality in real time. They love that it's decentralized. In other words, they the whole thing about, obviously about cultural, that they're trying to recode the culture by trying to recode the categories right now.
Like Fight Club, and there's no one person that can like get, you know, knocked off and topple the thing. They love that. And then what happens is that new moral precepts disseminate through the network like fashion, right? And so what that means is it's got all the same dynamics as fashion. So if you're closer to the central node of wokeism that came up with a certain, you know, I don't know, Latinx or whatever it is thing that they're doing, you know, right now, if you're closer to it and you're the first of your friends to adopt it, then they adopt it from you, then you're generated a higher social position within the hierarchy, just like people who come out of New York after Fashion Week, right? And so like, but the thing is that it adopts quickly. And because it goes quickly, their Overton window of acceptable behavior is constantly moving. And when it moves out from underneath somebody, then they get canceled. That's like Rachel Dolezal, right? She was doing everything right according to wokeism, and then the woke changed the rules out from underneath her and then canceled her for pretending to be black. And then I mean, she wrote a book afterwards that was all about how they should go back to the prior woke operating system, right? Because she liked that one. So
now this point gets really important, because there is a critique of what's happening that actually includes that. Well, let me go back to the Benjamin Boyce conversation.
Sorab thinks that conservatism has become just a way of losing more slowly, because he thinks it's in hock to too many of the presumptions of liberalism, which is just relentlessly hungry and determined to liquefy everything, and therefore, you know, if you're conservative, all you're doing is standing athwart history, yelling stop. But if you've already signed up to a belief in history and progress, then you're screwed, basically. And all you can ever really do is slow it down and sort of wish for a return to a period 5 minutes before whatever it is that's happening right now.
And so, in other words, with this disintegration of categories, well, maybe, and of course, you know, I know the orthodox among us are really going to be excited about what I'm going to say. Well, maybe liberalism is the problem. And that's a bit of a problem for Jordan Peterson, because in many ways, he and Douglas Murray and many others are like, no, let's go back to liberalism. But, Are we just, you know, we're going down the slide and we don't like where it's going, so we kind of put our sneakers down on that. I don't know if kids have all that, you know. When I was a kid, the slides were made of metal, and it was a nice smooth metal, and if you wanted to slow down, you pressed your sneakers against the side or you put them down. It's like you kind of try to go back up the slide, but you're already on the slide and you're already going down that way, and that's very much the fear.
So that's the kind of post-liberal critique of conservatism as a stance. The jury's out for me on whether that's all there is. I mean, I've joked and played and experimented with the phrase reactionary feminist over the last year, partly just because it's fun. It's a nice phrase to play with. But also as a sort of placeholder for the possibility that in fact conservatism is toast. And if that's true, and I'm not completely certain what I think about this yet, if it's true, it's because the entire liberal settlement is toast, because that was an effect of the industrial era and to an extent the print era as well. And we've now left the industrial era for the digital era, and in the process we've also left the print era. And the whole, most of the founding premises of liberalism, you know, the marketplace of ideas and free equal debate and the autonomous subject and so on and so forth, you know, that whole nexus of ideas, the sort of classical liberal ones, they're impossible to sustain except in a sort of semi-industrial print culture. You know, in the internet, in a discourse that's structured by people reading off the internet rather than reading out of books or pamphlets or whatever. It just doesn't work anymore. There's too much information. There's too much.
In other words, maybe this liberal modernist categorical structure was also a product of the speed of print, and perhaps the speed of the internet, which is a significant tick up from the speed of print. Well, we had the speed of radio, the speed of telegraph, the speed of newspapers, the speed of radio, the speed of television, the speed of cable television, all the way back to Neil Postman, where this channel really began. Now we're at the internet, and maybe what that means is, in fact, that this moral presuppositional updating that is being recoded by the speed of the internet is making liberalism untenable.
The information is too networked. People watch memes evolving live pretty much in real time. You can see a meme develop, it's sort of at warp speed on the internet over the course of 24 hours. And it's just not possible to hold to the ideas of a stable, objective world that you need, in order to sustain the kind of the framing premises of the liberal subject. So the whole edifice of liberalism is being rotted from the inside by its own invention, the internet.
Okay, back to Peterson and Rogan.
Back to the ancient Romans, the Greeks.
Yeah, Camille Paglia has made much of that.
Yeah.
I think probably it's not so much an obsession with gender, it's a disintegration of categories as a precursor. So it's a marker for if categories dissolve, especially fundamental ones, the culture is dissolving because the culture is a structure of category.
Okay, now integrate all of those little clips that we've just played into what he just said. The culture is dissolving because the categories, well, where do the categories come from? So this I put out last week or so. The religious spirit of your ancestors' code, your relevance realization software. And I touched on this video there because I had seen this clip, but I hadn't done the work to do what I'm doing right now. But this basically is it. This is the coding. And what happens when the speed of the recoding, Wokism, is basically about recoding on the fly. Now, if you watch the rest of our conversation, I'm pessimistic as to the long-term viability of that. And if you go back to yesterday's video, that's in some ways similar to my pessimism about nihilism's ability to actually create a culture and a structure. Yet we are still in the situation where the categories are coming apart.
Mm-hmm. That's what it is.
Right.
So, in fact, culture is a structure of category that we all share. So we see things the same way. Well, that's why we can talk. I mean, not exactly the same way, because then we'd have nothing to talk about. But roughly speaking, we have a bedrock of agreement. That's the Bible, by the way.
And he's right. He's exactly right. That's the Bible. But it's not just the Bible, it's the Bible and all of the mechanisms, all of the culture that has brought the Bible out into the world and have facilitated the Bible's coding of our world. Now, again, going back to the desert wanderings where he's going into, all of this stuff about the furniture of the tabernacle. So you read the book of Genesis, you get up to the getting people out of Egypt, you have the Passover, they get a little ways into the desert, there's some murmuring, there's some trouble, but then you have Sinai, and the Lord gives the law at Sinai, and people have read through Genesis, and oh wow, this book is amazing, all these cool stories, and Exodus is just like Genesis, all these cool stories, and then after Sinai, suddenly you get into the furnishing of the tabernacle, and people are like, oh, and then the laws, oh. Well, what's that? That's the coding of the categories that is going to establish Israel's unique, but it'll be a zone of proximal development with respect to the surrounding cultures, but Israel's unique coding amongst the nations for Israel to be a priesthood of the Lord to all nations. That's Israel's mission. Okay? So now this has been going on, and of course Christianity in the Roman Empire takes over, and as the Roman Empire collapsed, Christianity comes forward, then through the Middle Ages, and on and on and on. Christianity has been coding the categories of our culture for 2,000 years, building on the Hebraic concept. And of course, all of the bickering between Jews and Christians, and to a certain degree Muslims. We're all sort of in that family of code, but we're always working on that code. And, again, this is part of what I got into with BJ.
A structural question. How can you reinvent church in such a way that it provides the things that people are listening to Joe Rogan for?
Yeah,
right?
That's right. That's right.
You? If you can do that,
and can it? Because again, you're exactly right about wokism, because church should be participatory, because people don't just want to watch Joe Rogan. They do. You know what they really want to do? They want to be on Joe Rogan. Yeah, right. They walk around. Their internal monologue is them answering questions from Joe Rogan. Right. That's right. And that's, I think, one of the biggest lessons that the church can learn from the wokes is that participatory nature, and what they do in their sort of wholly concocted sessions looks a little bit like church, and for good reason. Yes. Right? So the church got to wake up, and they got to figure it out. They got to bring people back in and get them talking. I think that's the most important thing that needs to happen. And you need to have two versions. You need to have like an internet version, and you need to have a face-to-face version, and one translates to the next. The goal is to get people involved in one, move them to the other. There's going to be the dialogue, right? Yeah. And dialogue and support. And if you can do that, and you can make that a backbone, then once you have that backbone laid down, then you can scratch your head and figure out what you want to do about your dogma updates, because that's the stickiest thing in the world to even think about when it comes to religion, right? And this is one thing that the celebrity atheists have almost always get wrong. Dogma is updated all the time in religion. It's just that there are all these, it's sort of like the law, in that it's all stacked. And now I know I triggered a bunch of you with that, but there are layers of dogma. In other words, I've told the story before, when my grandmother went to church in flesh-colored stockings at the beginning of the 20th century in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and one of the elders said to her, kind of stopped her and said, "Young lady, you ought not to come to church without stockings." And my grandmother said, "These are flesh-colored stockings." Technology. I just did a conversation with. I haven't posted any clips of that yet. I'm still kind of processing the conversation that I did with Yvonne and Chris and Caleb from sort of the Artists Guild the Artists Estuary Guild that has grown up. And culture is changing so fast. The tiny little dogmas that are in all these little fringe churches, and lots of churches have all these little dogmas. I mean, in some teetotal churches, you may not drink alcohol. Other churches, alcohol is fine. Some churches, smoking is okay. Other churches, smoking is not good. Now that pot gets legalized, well, now we've got to figure out the dogma with respect to pot. And then same-sex marriage, we've got to figure out the dogma with respect to same-sex marriage. And when the state and the church have different scales of marriage, how do those things relate? And it's dogma all over the place. Now, we're not talking about, let's say, Christology or the Trinity, but we even are in this little corner of the internet. So, but these are all the categories and the category structures that we're working on and trying basically to figure out.
So I just walked through the Museum of the Bible in Washington. That was very cool. It's a very cool museum.
So the structure, that's what the Bible
that's what
provides.
I figured out. I just figured.
Notice Rogan, Peterson just laid this thing on Rogan, and Rogan is still coming to terms with what Peterson just said, because Peterson just laid on him, hey, you know what a culture is? One way of conceptualizing a culture is a framework, or actually a network of categories. And the degree to which those categories are stably, sufficiently, because it's always changing, There's parts of the structure that are more rigid and more central and more permanent, and other parts that are further off towards the fringe. And that's perhaps why gender becomes a really integral part of, well, how does this culture work? Sexuality is a pretty important element of human cultural evolution. Peterson's the one who's made the point about it's an insufficiently appreciated element of even human physical and genetic evolution. But that's very true of the much faster cultural evolutionary track when Brett Weinstein talks about true tracks, basically. So right there, Rogan is already like, whoa, you just said something really important, but Peterson's off to the races, and so he's going to zoom ahead, and poor Joe isn't going to have too much chance to catch up, because Joe Rogan is basically at the church of psychedelics, and I mean he is a drug doing hippie, as Peterson calls him later. That's who he is, and he's not down with the Bible or religion or any of these things. We don't need that. He's sort of continued. He's sort of stuck in the celebrity atheist mode. That basically says that a lot of this culture we can sort of assume because we inherit it, but we'll not call it Christian, and we'll certainly try and divorce it from the Bible, and we'll say that this came from the Greeks and Enlightenment, and it's sort of in this Christianity-free clean room, which of course is completely wrong. But what Jordan just gave Joe's reeling, but Jordan's going a mile a minute in this talk. Not as fast as he was with his Vervaeke conversation, but his dial's up a little high here.
This out this week. So it was a cool thing to walk through, because it's chronological. They have one floor, which is the history of the Bible. But it's not exactly that. It's really what it is the history of the book. Now, in many ways, the first book was the Bible. I mean, literally, because at one point there was only one book. Like, as far as our Western culture is concerned, there was one book. And for a while, literally, there was only one book. And that book was the Bible. And then before it was the Bible, it was it was scrolls, and it was writings on papyrus. But we were starting to aggregate written text together. And it went through all sorts of technological transformations. And then it became books that everybody could buy, the book everybody could buy. And the first one of those was the Bible. And then it became all sorts of books that everybody could buy. But all those books, in some sense, emerged out of that underlying book. And that book itself, the Bible isn't a book, it's a library. It's a collection of books. And so what I figured out was, partly because I was talking to my brother-in-law, Jim Keller, who's the world's greatest chip designer and has now designed a chip.
It's his brother-in-law. I guess he can call him the world's greatest chip designer. I don't know if he is or isn't, but I mean, chip designing is a pretty important thing.
That's as powerful as the human brain, which is optimized for artificial intelligence learning, by the way. And so I talked to him about that. He said, "You heard of the internet?" I said, "Yeah, Jim, I've heard of the internet." He said, "This is way more revolutionary than that." So in any case, we were talking about meaning in text, because we were talking about translation and the problem of understanding text. And Jim said, the meaning of words is coded in the relationship of the words to one another. And the postmodernists make that case, that all meaning is derived from the relationship between words. That's wrong, because, well, what about rage? That's not words. And what about moving your hand? That's not words. So it's wrong, but part of it's right, because the meaning we derive from the verbal domain is encoded in the relationship between words. So now then you think, well, let's think about the relationship between words. Well, some words are dependent on other words. Some ideas are dependent on other ideas. The more ideas are dependent on a given idea, the more fundamental that idea is. That's a definition of fundamental.
Okay, let's put Kermit back on the shelf here and with his buddy Joe and talk a little bit about what he just laid down. So Peter, classic Peterson once says the meaning of words is between the words. That's wrong, but it's not really wrong. It's only part wrong. And the truth is, that's not all it is, because the meaning of words is not only caught between words in the text, it's also caught between the words and the other layers of the world. The physical layer, the relational layers. And words are this amazing upper register magic, because words are connecting the world around. And I've tried to back modernists off of understanding truth as merely referential. Okay? Truth certainly is referential. When I talk about the cell phone stand that I have made internet famous, here it is. Well, you knew which cell phone stand it was. I really knew which cell phone stand it was because it sits over here by all of these little yellow pieces of paper that Rick brings me on the Friday Q&As, which I should probably put in the garbage can. But I know which cell phone stand because, well, the words connect that. And so when in the comment section you talk about the cell phone stand that has been around the channel now for pretty much the whole time the channel's been around, yeah, here it is. Here is the famous cell phone stand. Now we get back to the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversation when they talked about Elvis's guitar, or they talked about Elton John's glass. Same thing. So words have meaning between each other and also with reference to physical objects and also with references to events, which are, so that's where you get sort of the massive compressive power that words have. If I say the French Revolution, well, how much is included in the French Revolution, or the American Revolution, or the United States government, or the Canadian Truckers' Revolt, or. So words have this incredibly powerful way of sort of connecting our world. And obviously at the beginning of the Gospel of John, the Logos becomes flesh. I mean, just that conceptualization is just mind-blowingly powerful. You're hard-pressed to articulate the incarnation in a way as economic as that. Now, later in this conversation, when they talk about comedy, it's an amazing part. I don't know if I'll comment on it at all, but because I don't have a lot to say about it. But Joe Rogan is right, because economy of words, which is what the Bible is about. If you read someone like Robert Alter, who's a Jewish scholar, who in many ways revived the literary appreciation of the Hebrew scriptures by noting the economy of words, that the Bible is powerful because, especially in the Hebrew, it uses so few words to communicate so much. So these words are actually, they're best not to think about as objects, which is sort of the way at the height of modernity words were assumed. That's how we assumed words work. Now, if you pay close attention, let's say comparing Greek and Hebrew to the this is what happens when the phone rings and comparing Greek and Hebrew to the text of the King James Version, there's a lot of attempting to translate in a sort of word-to-word correspondence. Now, that can be a really helpful thing if you want to do a word study. It can also be sort of a distorted thing. But in many ways, Peterson is right here, because, especially in the English language world, that King James Bible coded the language, as did Shakespeare. And the point that Peterson is making here is that there's sort of a stack. It's really hard to understand Shakespeare if you don't understand the Bible. It's really hard to understand the development of English literature if you don't understand Shakespeare. And on down it goes, and down to Old English things and a bunch of that. And so when Peterson is talking about the structure of the culture, see, that's why I get so frustrated with with some of this stuff. And I'm sure I've done my own part of it too, but some of the stuff on the internet say, oh, Peterson mentioned the Bible. But they don't stop and ask, what did he say about the Bible? Part of it is because Christians are so insecure that any kind of validation by someone outside of them, it's me, they're talking about me, they're talking about my book. And it's like, okay, but we're not in junior high anymore. So listen to the whole clip and think about everything he's saying here, because there's actually more here that we can learn from.
What about moving your hand? That's not words, so it's wrong, but part of it's right, because the meaning we derive from the verbal domain is encoded in the relationship between words. So now then you think, well, let's think about the relationship between words. Well, some words are dependent on other words. Some ideas are dependent on other ideas. The more ideas are dependent on a given idea, the more fundamental that idea is. That's a definition of fundamental. So now imagine you have an aggregation of texts in a civilization. You say, which are the fundamental texts? And the answer is the texts upon which most other texts depend. And so you'd put Shakespeare way in there in English, because so many texts are dependent on Shakespeare's literary.
And by the way, this is why Richard Dawkins, of all people, was advocating that English school children get taught the Bible. Because even Richard Dawkins notes, you can't understand our culture and our worldview without the Bible. Now, of course, Richard Dawkins believes what he believes about the Bible, but that's why you get the strange realization that Richard Dawkins has. And this is also part of the reason why Wokism has tended to attack the classics, because if nobody knows Plato or Shakespeare or fairy tales or the Bible, if you really want to make the culture anew, you've got to get rid of all the texts. Of course, Orwell saw this and wrote about it in 1984, because all of the culture is based on the texts. Now, the naivete is that we're just going to make this culture up as we go along. It'll be great. It's kind of like kids at play in the schoolyard. And, part of Peterson's point is that maybe they're at play now the way they are because they didn't get the play that they needed when they were younger. And they didn't figure out that you can't just sit down and write a fairy tale or rewrite Shakespeare. And, no matter how many monkeys with typewriters, you don't have time enough in the universe to rewrite Shakespeare with random monkeys on a typewriter.
Revelations. And Milton would be fundamental. So now imagine you have an aggregation of texts in a civilization. You say, which are the fundamental texts? And the answer is the texts upon which most other texts depend. And so you'd put Shakespeare way in there in English, because so many texts are dependent on Shakespeare's literary revelations. And Milton would be in that category, and Dante would be in that category, at least in translation. Fundamental authors, part of the Western canon, not because of the arbitrary dictates of power, but because those texts influenced more other texts. And then you think about that as a hierarchy, okay, with the Bible at its base, which is certainly the case. Now imagine that's the entire corpus of linguistic production, all things considered. Now, how do you understand that? Like, literally, how do you understand that? The answer is you sample it by reading and listening to stories and listening to people talk. You sample that whole domain. You build a low-resolution representation of that inside you, and then you listen and see through that.
So this was the drawing that I used in the previous videos, and that is exactly what Peterson is talking about. That you listen and see through that. That's the interpretive filter through which you understand the world, because you're doing it all through language. And on this little diagram, so this filter is actually, of course, not here in front of you. The filter is, in fact, in your head, and it's not only just made up of texts and the kinds of things we think about when we think about religion, things like words, things like buildings, things like songs. It's actually filtered through all of the people who were filtering it, and on and on and on and on. And Peterson, what he said here is exactly right. I don't know if I can I wonder if I can pull this off. See, this is why I wanted to do a puppet, because his hand signals are really good in this. So you got to go back and watch it on Rogan, because he's really into it and he's doing it right. And so I could maybe use Kermit's hands to do it, or I could, but I can't play the darn video. Thank you so much. Because if anything is fair use, this is fair use. But once I play this video on the screen, baby, I get that big blocked.
Would be in that category, and Dante would be in that category, at least in translation. Fundamental authors, part of the Western canon, not because of the arbitrary dictates of power, but because those texts influenced more other texts. And then you think about that as a hierarchy, okay, with the Bible at its base, which is certainly the case.
Okay, so you've got the Bible at the base. Now, of course, Latin does go, well, the drawing isn't quite right, because the Bible actually has to be far deeper. But what I tried to get at is, you know, Christians, of course, say inspiration in terms of the Bible. But if you believe in something like organic inspiration, you believe that God also worked within the processes that brought forth the Bible to the world. And talk a lot about that. And what do you mean by God, and how does God work, and how does God move, and what do we mean by God, and God number one and God number two. But then the Bible becomes the basis for all of this work that happens in English and Latin and German, and of course there's plenty of crossover between them. And this is what he means, that the Bible is at the base of all of this in the culture.
Linguistic production, all things considered. Now, how do you understand that? Like, literally, how do you understand that? The answer is you sample it by reading and listening to stories and listening to people talk. You sample that whole domain. You build a low-resolution representation.
Okay, what's he saying? Well, so you're living in this world here, and you are sampling this domain. Let's say you live here in the English language. Now, the thing itself is too massive for you to take all of it in, but maybe you had some German ancestry, or maybe you grew up in the Roman Catholic Church, so you have some Latin in there. But you only sample it, but that then creates in you this mapping. Okay, that imprinting that has been happening to you by your culture, the categories, all this stuff that you've been absorbing even before you were born. Why do I say before you were born? Because you were already mapping your parents' voices on you before you left the womb. All of this stuff is coming up through you.
Of that inside you, and then you listen and see through that. And so it isn't that the Bible is true. It's that the Bible is the precondition for the manifestation of truth, which makes it way more true than just true. It's a whole different kind of true. And I think it's
the precondition for the manifestation of truth. It's the filter through which you see everything in the world. And what do you say? Well, that's more than true. It's not just referential. Oh, look, music stand. No, or not music stand, but cell phone stand. No, it's the entire world of categories through which you say cell phone stand good, cell phone stand bad. Which cell phone stand good? Oh, look, you've got a little gap here so that you can put your little connector in here, and well, it's wide enough because it's an old one that all you Apple people could use the miserable wide little thing that you used to have instead of now the little lightning gap because you're resisting USB-C, on and on and on and on. All of that stuff. It's the precondition for truth. And Peterson is nailing it here.
I think this is not only literally the case, factually, I think it can't be any other way. It's the only way we can solve the problem of perception.
You say
and now Joe Rogan, poor Joe, is trying to figure out, my head hurts. What are you doing to me, Jordan?
Precondition of the manifestation of truth?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
How do you know when what you and I are saying is true?
Well, it depends on what we're saying.
Not exactly. You know this, Joe. The fact that you're so popular, this is a mystery. And I've been tweeting about it while people have been attacking you. Why is...
I've been tweeting about it while people have been attacking you. Because, Joe, you're not on Twitter there to defend yourself. And Joe's like, that's a feature, not a bug.
Joe Rogan's so popular. He's a gateway to the alt-right. It's like, no, he's the psychedelic hippie. That's a stupid hypothesis. That's wrong. Well, he's a propagandist. It's like, no, Joe's an honest man. And he actually says what he believes to be true. But let's think about that, because that isn't exactly what you do. You follow the conversation and you listen, and you spontaneously manifest words that indicate your reaction. And it isn't the words themselves exactly that are true, because you might be wrong and you might be right, right? I mean, what do you know or what I know? We're going to be wrong a bunch during this conversation. But the process that we're manifesting in the discovery of truth and untruth, that's not wrong. That's exactly right.
Okay, so now he's getting into the process, because it's not just all the words that are floating out there. It's all of the updating. That's the DL logos. It's all of the updating that we're doing when we're talking. Now it might be tiny, tiny little updating, because this kind of stuff is so massive, or actually it's more this slide that I used before, because we're all in these national silos, and it might be updating, but all along the way, we're still working on all of this stuff in here, talking to each other, comparing notes, watching the Canadians have drama, watching the Americans have drama. You know, Germany will have its drama, the UK will, but he's talking about the process of conversation is actually the way that we find truth, and we update all this stuff.
Have a lot of sympathy for both groups. The group that's like,
oh, you saw how the sausage is made. So in my conversation with Eamon and Catherine, we were talking about these two groups, because there are groups within the church that sort of need their categories are for the most part still intact enough that what you want to do is bring in nuance to sort of coax the timid and the gentle into greater realization. There are others who in their life, the categories have been shattered by trauma, shattered by decay of cultural decay, of social breakdown, of all of this. And you have to sort of try and figure out how those things work.
I need to get out of these rules and everything at church. And it's because I have a lot of sympathy for both groups. The group that's like, I need to get out of these rules and everything at church. And it's because it's been done in a way that's been heavy-handed or, lacking love. It's just follow the rules. And then I have this contingent of clients where, all of them are like in their early 20s, mid 20s. They're a single parent. They've just gotten clean, and, they're saying like, I need to find one person to settle down with. What I'm looking for is to be married and have stability. I can't wait to get a job. I'm keeping alcohol out of my house. And they have a list of things that it's like, oh, these are the things that.
See, they've got really rigid categories, because the categories have sort of, so here are my categories and I'm going to stick with them.
I'm hearing that the other side's running away from, and how do we reconcile these without overcorrecting, right?
Yeah.
So it touches on what you guys are both saying, but it also goes back to what you were saying, Paul, with the question like, so how do we how do we bring together psychology and the church? How are those supposed to marry? And the way that we've gone about it is you see the biblical categories as the master categories. So the overarching categories through which you understand things are the biblical categories. But counseling is about how do you help people grow and mature, right? Whatever the issue is, if it's trauma, if it's whatever, the question always is, how are you helping this person to develop and grow? And so the answer is...
But again, the categories have to be there. And as she said, well, these are the biblical categories. These are the categories around which the culture has formed. And if you lose those categories, well, are those categories arbitrary? That's some of what I want to say. This is where we get into nominalism. Are those categories arbitrary? Are the relations arbitrary? Or are there, in fact, categories and elements that are fixed? And now this is enormously complex and enormously nuanced, but how we relate to those categories will mean all the difference in the world in terms of where our life goes.
You need a whole stinking lot of wisdom, because each person and each situation is really, really different. And so you need a lot of wisdom. And so you guys are just playing with, there's different things different people need, right? Some people need beauty, some people need truth, some people need a firm hand, some people need extra rope to almost hang themselves with. There's different things we all need, but that's how I think you properly integrate psychology, is you say there's a lot here to glean from which we can have much more wisdom when we come to people's cases. So when you tell me, my mom was borderline, there's a psychological category, right? I can say, okay, well, here's this cluster of symptoms. Which out of those things were true for you? What we know is that usually this is the case for kids who have parents like that. What out of that was true? And oftentimes people will say, oh, I didn't know that was a thing, but I experienced that. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't. And you can map these patterns more quickly, and it's not 100% one for one, but it gets you further down the road, because it's just saying, what are the patterns that you see in people's lives when you have this constellation of relationships who operate in these ways? How does it tend to work itself out? And then you can take that and say, well, in that constellation of patterns with a parent like that, there's like 5 ways people usually react. What out of these ways maps the most? Is there something that's like a secondary one? And depending on their personality, depending on how they responded, their resilience, the other factors in their life, they'll have a little bit of a different, but it moves you forward faster when you have more wisdom, which you can glean from the information you can gather. But you have that master category, which says, this is our goal. Our goal is for you to mature and grow as a person. We're going to do that by developing you, and it's going to look different. You're going to need different things depending on where you're coming from.
But of course, with mature and grow, you're going to have I got to bring myself back into the picture here. With mature and grow, you're going to have a hierarchy that you're working on. You're going to say, this is maturity, this is immaturity. You're going to have those categories. You're going to have value hierarchies. You're going to have a lot of stuff going on there. Oops.
And one of the things with psychology too is pretty much every psychologist, I actually see each psychological system as being much more representative of that that person's own psychology. So Jung, when I read Jung, I get to know Jung, and I know the way Jung sees people. And when I read Freud, I see how Freud sees people. And there's a lot of diversity within psychology because there's a lot of diversity in how people are. But basically, a psychological system is a really great transference. I get to see everything about how you map the world because you tell me, oh, this means this and this means that, which doesn't necessarily mean that's true, but there's a certain set of people that will see it and experience it that way. And then when you find people, you find most of the time there's a set that will match better. And so there'll be a system of thought and a way that they make connections, because you have people where CBT fits. They're super logical, they're super ordered, and CBT is a great fit. And most people hate CBT. They don't do it, they don't like it. Then you have people where it's like psychoanalytics. yes, let's talk about my dreams. I've already been writing them down for 5 years. I love,
Yeah.
they're there. And it's like, yeah, that's how you map reality. And so this is a language to speak to you. And so I think that issue that you guys were talking around, it's wisdom. And that's what would...
In your point, it's backed up by all the aggregate studies that say, well, at the end of the day, the treatment modality doesn't even really matter that much. When you shake it all out, all the numbers, they're basically the same. So, I hear psychologists say like, well, whatever your approach is, just make sure you believe it. Yeah. Like, okay.
Oh, I've heard that before.
Inhibits not just your intellectual
way you express yourself and the way you see the world and the amount of stimulation you get out of interacting with people. So it'll inhibit your intellectual development because you won't be interested in expanding ideas, and you may look to escape.
It inhibits not just your intellectual development, but the entire unfolding of your existence.
Yeah.
One of the things that I hope to talk to people a lot about on this tour is the idea that I did a series on Genesis that became quite popular, and one of the stories I analyzed was the story of Abraham's. Very cool story, because Abraham's like 80 years old, living in his father's tent.
Okay, I think that's probably good enough for this video. We'll have more to do at 1:35 in that, and I found this to be a fairly content-rich video of Peterson. So let me know what you think, and we'll see how much we keep using the puppets, because, yeah, I can't just play the video for you.